I have a question for you that sounds like the start of a dystopian nightmare. What happens to a country when 90%, 90, of its adult male population just disappears off the face of the earth? I'm not talking about a theoretical scenario. I'm talking about a real place that went through a demographic apocalypse so severe it effectively ceased to exist as a functioning state. We are talking about Paraguay. Most people just know it as that quiet, landlocked shape in the dead center of a South America map. Maybe you know about the cheap electronics or the endless supply of beef, but the origin story of these people? It is hands down the most terrifying, tragic, and ultimately badass survival story in human history. We are going to dig into how a place once called the Paradise of Muhammad turned into a literal green hell. We'll cover a socialist utopia that existed centuries before Marx, a dictator with a spy network so terrifying people were afraid to speak his name, and a war so devastating it makes the American Civil War look like a minor skirmish. Stick around because by the end of this, you're going to wonder how this country is even still on the map. Let's start at the very beginning. The year is 1537. The Spanish conquistadors arrive up the river. They aren't looking for farm dirt. They are chasing a legend, the Sierra de la Plata, the Mountain of Silver. They're greedy, they're far from home, and they're expecting to find cities paved with gold. Instead, they find insane heat, jaguars, mosquitoes, and the Guarani people. Now, in most of the Americas, the story is sadly predictable. Europeans arrive, they fight, they conquer, they enslave. But Paraguay? Paraguay got weird immediately. The Guarani chiefs operated on kinship alliances. They looked at these bearded, sweaty strangers with loud boomsticks and decided, we don't need to fight you, we need to absorb you into the family. They used a custom called tovaya, brother-in-law. To make peace, the chiefs offered the Spaniards their daughters, sisters, and nieces. And the Spanish captains, well, they leaned into it, hard. The settlement of Asuncion became known notoriously back in Spain as the Paradise of Muhammad because the settlers were living like sultans with harems of 10, 20, sometimes 30 indigenous women. The Catholic priests were writing frantic letters back to the king saying, hey, things are getting out of hand down here. The men aren't conquering, they're assimilating. But this wasn't just debauchery, it was the biological Big Bang of the nation. Within one single generation, the mestizo was born. Paraguay became a nation of mixed blood faster and more thoroughly than anywhere else. But while the settlers were busy in Asuncion, something even wilder was happening deep in the jungle. Enter the Jesuits. These guys in black robes show up in the 1600s and decide to run a social experiment that has no parallel in human history. They built the Reductions. Think of a communist-style theocracy protected by the Pope running completely autonomously in the middle of the rainforest. The Jesuits and the Guarani built massive, beautiful stone cities. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving. They had full orchestras playing Baroque music in the jungle. They were printing books before New York City even had a newspaper. They were exporting yerba mate and building violins that rivaled the best in Europe. It was a state within a state, safe from the Spanish settlers who wanted to enslave them. The jealousy from the outside world was immense, and you know what happens to utopias? They get crushed. To the east, in Brazil, the Portuguese slave hunters, the dreaded bandeirantes, were coming. They viewed these unarmed missions not as churches, but as an all-you-can-eat buffet of pre-trained, healthy labor. In 1631, this leads to one of the greatest escape stories ever told, the Guaira Exodus. Imagine having to evacuate an entire province. Father Montoya realizes they can't fight, they have to move. 12,000 people. They build 700 massive rafts and start floating down the river. It's an armada of desperation. packing up their entire lives, their statues, their children, fleeing the slave hunters. Then they hit the massive Guaira Falls. Imagine Niagara Falls on steroids. You couldn't raft over them, you would die instantly. So what did they do? They dismantled the rafts. They carried the heavy logs, the supplies, and the sick people through the dense jungle on foot for days, bypassing the falls, all while the banderantes were nipping at their heels. At the bottom of the falls, they rebuilt the rafts and kept going. This moment cemented the Paraguayan soul. It proved that these people possessed an absolute, almost superhuman stubbornness, the ability to suffer, to move, and to rebuild from zero. Fast forward to 1811, the Jesuits are long gone, kicked out by the king. Paraguay bloodlessly kicks out the Spanish and becomes independent. But then they get a leader who is, let's just say, intense. Dr. José Gaspar Rodríguez de Francia. They called him El Supremo, and he meant it. Francia was a paranoid genius. He hated the colonial elite and the idea of a pure Spanish aristocracy, so he did something radical. He issued a decree legally banning Europeans from marrying other Europeans. If you were a white Spanish male, you had to marry a black, indigenous, or mestizo woman. He literally legislated the final mixing of the population. He sealed the borders tight. No one in, no one out. For decades, Paraguay was the hermit kingdom of South America, incubating in total isolation. He had a terrifying spy network called the Piragües, which means hairy feet because they moved so silently you never heard them coming. People were afraid to whisper his name in their own homes. But inside that bizarre authoritarian shell, the country became strong, self-sufficient, unbreakable. By the 1860s, under new leadership, Paraguay was shockingly modern. They had the first railroad in South America. They had a telegraph system. They had shipyards and foundries. They had zero foreign debt. They were the industrializing Japan of Latin America while their neighbors were still fighting messy civil wars. They were wealthy, proud, and heavily armed. And then hubris struck. A new leader, Francisco Solano López, takes charge. He inherited a Ferrari and decided to drive it 200 miles an hour off a cliff. By his side was the glamorous and controversial Irish mistress, Elisa Lynch. She brought Parisian fashion and grand pianos through the jungle, throwing champagne parties while cloud storms gathered. Some say she pushed López into greatness, others say she pushed him toward disaster. López looked at the map and felt suffocated by the giants next door, Brazil and Argentina. Tensions rose over borders and influence, gambles were made, and suddenly tiny Paraguay declares war, not just on one country, on three. Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay formed the Triple Alliance. It's three giants against one landlocked nation. The math was impossible from day one. In a normal war, the smaller country fights a few battles, realizes they're outgunned, and surrenders. They pay a fine, lose a province, and go home to lick their wounds. But Paraguayans, they didn't know how to surrender. It wasn't in their vocabulary. The war drags on for 6 grinding years. It was total war. At first, they had victories. At the Battle of Curupaiti, the Paraguayans dug brilliant trenches and mowed down 4,000 attacking Allied soldiers while losing fewer than 100 men. It was a masterclass in defense. But they couldn't replace their losses. The Allies could replace theirs forever. The tide turned. The Battle of Tuyuti became the bloodiest day in South American history, a meat grinder where Paraguay lost the cream of its army in an afternoon. But López refuses to quit. He retreats into the interior, dragging the starving population with him into the mud and disease. It got desperate. The women donated their jewelry, wedding rings, heirlooms to the Book of Gold to fund the war effort. When the gold ran out, they gave their labor. Church bells were melted down for cannons. Cholera and dysentery swept through the camps, killing more than the bullets. The men died first, then the grandfathers took up arms and died, then the teenagers. By 1869, there are almost no combat-age males left alive in the entire country. So who defends the flag when the tanks are rolling in? The children. This is the part of the story that genuinely breaks you. August 16, 1869, the Battle of Acosta New. Lopez needs a rear guard to escape. He conscripts an army composed largely of 3,500 boys. We are talking 9, 10, 12 years old. Historical accounts say commanders painted fake beards on the boys' faces with soot to make them look like men from a distance, hoping to scare the enemy. They didn't have enough guns, so many fought with sticks and rocks. They stood in a field against 20,000 veteran Brazilian cavalrymen. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The mothers stood on the sidelines, and when the firing started, many ran into the blaze, throwing rocks at the soldiers, trying to die alongside their sons. Today in Paraguay, Children's Day isn't about balloons and cake. It's a solemn memorial to this day, the day the nation sacrificed its future. When the war finally ended in 1870, with Lopez dying in the mud, the statistics were apocalyptic. Before the war, roughly 525,000 people. After the war, maybe 220,000 scattered, starving survivors. But here is the number that haunts demographers to this day. Of those survivors, only about 28,000 were men. Think about that ratio. 1 man for every 4 to 7 women, depending on the region. An entire civilization wiped of its male lineage in 5 years. The people of Paraguay were now effectively a nation of women. They call them the Cuña Guapa, the hard-working woman. The social structure completely flipped. The few remaining men became pampered, scarce resources, but the labor, farming the fields, rebuilding the burned houses, burying the dead, raising the next generation, fell 100% on the shoulders of the women. They didn't just grieve, they went to work. And yes, they repopulated. Free love became an absolute survival necessity. The church looked the other way because there was no other choice if the nation was to continue existing. Paraguay is a country standing today because its women refused to let it die in the 1870s. You'd think that would be enough tragedy for one nation. You'd think they would stay quiet forever. But the Paraguayan spirit is something else entirely. 60 years later, in 1932, another neighbor came knocking. Bolivia wanted the Chaco, that massive, dry, thorny wilderness in the west. Bolivia had oil money, more soldiers, and German commanders training them. They thought Paraguay was still weak, still broken from the genocide of the Triple Alliance. They expected an easy walkover. They were dead wrong. The Chaco War was brutal. They called it the Green Hell. It wasn't just a battlefield, it was an oven. Soldiers wrote diaries about drinking their own urine or sucking moisture out of cactus roots just to survive another hour. The Bolivian highlanders, used to the cool Andes Mountains, were dropping from thirst and heat stroke before they even saw a Paraguayan. The Paraguayans knew the heat, they were tougher, and they had a secret weapon, their native language. They used Guarani on the radio as an unbreakable code. The Bolivians couldn't understand the orders being relayed. Walking barefoot through thorn forests, the Paraguayan army encircled the superior Bolivian forces and starved them out. They didn't just defend their land, they won a crushing victory and doubled their territory. The phoenix had literally risen from the ashes of the 1870s to dominate the battlefield of the 1930s. So, when you look at Paraguay on a map today, remember that its existence is a statistical miracle. It's a culture forged in the absolute hottest fires of history, a mix of Spanish pride and Guarani tenacity, welded together by the most traumatic war the Americas has ever seen. But there is one massive mystery we haven't touched yet. We know who the people are and how they survived. But what about the name, Paraguay? What does it actually mean? Is it a river of crowns, a river of parrots, or is it named after a powerful man who history tried to erase? In part 2, we are going to crack that linguistic code. Hit subscribe because the answer is way more complicated than you think.